Matti Friedman, welcome to Amsterdam.
Thank you so much.
It's a very big honor for us to have you here. We are going to talk about the media coverage of Israel and the colorized journalism, the media bias. You wrote some very accurate pieces about that phenomenon, which we really understand and know here in Holland as well as in the rest of the Western country. You experienced it yourself. We're going to talk about that as a correspondent for AP, Associated Press, in your years in Jerusalem as a reporter, 15 years ago, I think. And first, I'd like to ask you a more personal question for an introduction for the people in the room which are not very familiar with you yet. So you were born in Toronto, Canada, and then at a certain moment you thought, well, I want to go to Israel. And the age was 17. Did you remember the idea, the moment of your decision to immigrate to Israel?
First of all, it's wonderful to be here. And it's wonderful to be with you, Roderick, and it's been wonderful to be in Amsterdam for the past few days and get wonderful city and wonderful community. I was 17. I thought I was an adult at the time, and I had been reading, I guess, too much Zionist ideology. I read books by A.D. Gordon and Jabotinsky and Borokhov and the great thinkers of labor Zionism. A bad idea, I think, when you're an impressionable high school student in terms of setting expectations for what you're going to find when you go to Israel. But I decided that I would finish high school and then go to work on a kibbutz, which seemed to me like a socialist paradise. And I went.
It wasn't, or?
You know, it kind of was. I arrived at 17. I wasn't planning to stay. This was just supposed to be 1 year in Israel, and I ended up on a very small religious kibbutz called Ma'ale Gilboa. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's a tiny place. At the time, it was a failing kibbutz. It was fewer than 30 families. And the place was, they were about to turn off the lights. I mean, the economy had flatlined and tons of people had left. And of course, I didn't know any of that. And the ideology was dead and socialism was dead, and but I just didn't know. And to me, it's like paradise. And I showed up at 17 and I milked cows for a year. And I learned Hebrew, and I lived on this beautiful mountain, Mount Gilboa, which is famous for being where King Saul fell on his sword in the famous battle against the Philistines, and then King David curses Mount Gilboa famously in the Bible, saying that no rain or dew shall fall on Mount Gilboa. So I was living on this mountain overlooking the Bet Shean Valley and the fish ponds and fields in the valley over to the hills of Jordan, and I was by myself for the first time, and I remember standing on a pile of hay bales that I had stacked with a tractor, which they let me drive, even though I did not have a license to drive a car, let alone a tractor. That was Israel in the 1990s. I just showed up as a Canadian kid and they said, sure, take this tractor. And I stacked these hay bales, and I was standing on top of the hay bales, and I was looking over the valley, and I realized I was not going to leave.
Yeah. That was your new country, you thought. So then you went to, Naomi said it already, you went into the army, the Israeli military army in Lebanon. And then you became a journalist. Was that a no-brainer? Was that an idea? I'm a true searcher by heart.
If you look at my 8th grade yearbook in Toronto, there's a picture of me. It's a very nerdy picture that I'd rather you actually not see. But underneath the picture, it said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said journalist. And I obviously didn't know what it was, but it's an idea that I had from a very young age. It seemed like an amazing excuse to go to talk to people and explore other countries, and you ask people questions and they have to answer your questions, and this is what I would do even if I wasn't being paid to do it. So it always seemed to me that that would be a great profession. And before I went into the army, I did an internship at a magazine called the Jerusalem Report, which some of you may remember. It used to be a great news magazine in English in Jerusalem. That was my first taste of the profession, and I was hooked, so I've been doing it ever since.
So you became a journalist in 2000, early 2000s?
Right. I mean, I was an intern at the Jerusalem Report in 1997 when I was 19. And then when I got out of the army, I actually wrote a few times when I was in the army against army regulations. You're not supposed to be writing for newspapers when you're in the army. I wrote an article from inside the security zone in South Lebanon in the 1990s. Luckily for me, the army never noticed that I did that. But then I freelanced when I was in university, and then they hired me when I was in my last year of university. I dropped out of university to take this job at the Jerusalem Report, and that's when I began doing it full time.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the critics we have on mainstream media, and how mainstream media has changed in the years. Your first years as a reporter, as a journalist, if you look at the media then, the news media, was it much different than now?
Yes, I think it was different. I mean, I spent, and you of course remember, I spent 3 years working for the Report, which was a local Israeli magazine in English, and then in 2006, I got hired by the Associated Press, which is the big US news agency, AP, which is the world's largest news organization, according to the AP. Yeah. According to Reuters, it's Reuters. But we take this all with a grain of salt. But yes, when I started to work for the AP, this was before social media. So this is 2006. So Facebook and Twitter are about to hit, but it hasn't happened yet. And in retrospect, just like I caught the very end of the kibbutz movement without really realizing that's what was happening, I caught the end of the old media world, where there was still a lot of kind of older journalists in the newsroom, and they'd been around. They were all cranky, and they got angry at the young reporters, and they had high standards, and everything was going down the drain. You worked with people like that too. Nothing serious anymore. But these guys were very important to holding the whole thing together. And I think that the goal was still explanatory journalism. That's what I entered in 2006, and I had admittedly, I think, quite a naive idea of what American journalism was. It was heavily influenced by All the President's Men, the movie with
Robert
Redford. Yes. Yeah. First of all, I thought if I became a journalist, I would look like Robert Redford. And that turned out not to be true. Wow. And it certainly wasn't true of many of my colleagues, but I think I caught the end of that news world, which was still the old media world of Woodward and Bernstein, but it was about to change, I think, quite radically precisely in the years that I was at the AP.
Exactly. Because you experienced between 2006 and 2011 a Hamas imitating reporters and local stringers working for AP, and your bosses gave in to those intimidations. You wrote about it, 2 essays. About this, what happened, and can you describe for us what happened between Hamas and the local stringers who work for AP, and the reaction of your bosses at AP?
Right, this came as a surprise. It took me a while to figure out exactly what was going on. So what I ended up writing in 2014 in those essays, and what I'm saying now, is the result of me thinking about it for a very long time and writing about it. I didn't immediately understand what was going on, but Hamas takes over Gaza in 2007, and the first really bad round of violence between Israel and Hamas was at the very end of 2008 or early 2009. At the time, we thought it was bad. Unfortunately, in light of the tragedy that we've seen over the past 3 years, it doesn't seem that bad, but it was bad at the time. And it was the first really full-on confrontation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, with Hamas in control of Gaza and essentially in control of information in Gaza. And I was an editor on the desk in Jerusalem, which means that I'm getting called by reporters in the field, including our reporters in Gaza. They're reporting information over the phone, and I'm sitting at a desk, which is called the desk, and I'm writing this. I'm writing the story essentially. So in an AP story, you'll often have a byline on the story. For example, that story would have said Ibrahim Barzak, Gaza. He was the reporter in the field, but it was actually being written by Matti Friedman in Jerusalem, and this is quite common. And in this, in the story that I'm thinking of specifically, which I wrote about, the reporter, who was an excellent reporter, his father had been the AP reporter, and he had been up until that point really an excellent reporter. Most of the work of the foreign press in Gaza is done by Palestinians from Gaza, just so that's clear. And there had never been any reason not to trust his copy, but he reported that morning that Hamas fighters were dressed as civilians and being counted as civilians in the death toll. Now, this is very important because the center of the coverage in that war for the first time, and we know it now after October 7th, is the death toll as published by an organization called the Health Ministry of Gaza. The Health Ministry of Gaza is Hamas. but it has a kind of different name to make the statistics seem more acceptable. So we're reporting this death toll as if all of the fatalities are civilians. So it's important to note that Hamas fighters are being counted among the civilians. A few hours later, I get a call from the reporter, and he says, Matti, you need to take that detail out of the story. It had already gone out. You need to take that detail out of the story. And it was clear that he'd been threatened. And I didn't need to ask, and I also didn't hesitate to take the detail out of the story. We put a new version of the story out on the AP Wire, and I asked the editor who was in charge of the desk if we could append an editor's note at the bottom that said AP is now collaborating with Hamas censorship.
To be transparent.
To be transparent, exactly. Every time there's an Israeli military censor, for those who don't know. The Israeli military censor intervenes very rarely, mostly in cases that involve Israel's nuclear program. Where you're not actually allowed to say anything other than program. And so the censor gets involved, and every time that happens to an AP story, we would write, the Israeli military censor vetted this story, just so that everyone knows what's going on. But I was overruled, so we did not mention the Hamas censorship. And from that moment, more or less, so this is the very end of 2008, the AP, like its sister organizations, I feel bad sometimes picking on the AP. The AP isn't worse than any other news organization. They were just stupid enough to hire me. That's the only thing. That's the only reason I concentrate on them. But what I say about AP is true of Reuters, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post. I don't know the Dutch media world, but I imagine that it's...
What did you say to the editor-in-chief who said, well, you have to do this?
I did what I was told.
Yeah.
I did what I was told. I put the story out, and the story did not have that detail in it. And even though I knew, as my colleagues did too, that from that moment, Hamas was essentially dictating the story from Gaza by using intimidation of local reporters and institutions like the health ministry, which is, the pipeline of information from Gaza is very important for us to understand now after October 7th, but it's been going on for almost 20 years. Essentially, the source of information is Hamas, because the reporters in Gaza fall into two groups. Either they're members of Hamas or they're intimidated by Hamas. Functionally, there is no difference. It's Hamas getting their information out. Sometimes the information comes directly to the reporters through the Ministry of Health, which is Hamas. Sometimes it's laundered through NGOs or through activist reporters who put it out under their name. So it could come from the UN, for example. Stories about dogs raping prisoners, things like that. There's a pipeline that goes through certain NGOs. The information is laundered and then reported by credulous or ideologically affiliated media organizations, and that's how we have this picture that's coming out of Gaza that is essentially the picture that Hamas wants.
Yeah. So that was 2008. It's not going to be better. It's even worse, getting worse and worse since 7th of October, of course.
Yes, I would like to say that those two essays that I wrote completely revolutionized press coverage of Israel, and that all of my colleagues read these essays and said, you know what, Matti's right. We've been doing it wrong. Let's change everything. You'll be shocked, Roderick, to hear that this did not happen. And it's interesting. It was interesting for me to learn that it's a test for a journalist how you respond to being covered by a journalist. You would think that would be considered to be a kind of test of your journalistic integrity. How do you respond to coverage? Because you're constantly telling other people they have to respond to your coverage. So what do you do when you're covered? They responded very poorly. And even though those two essays, it's about 8,000 words all told, and every single comma is correct. Every single word in those essays is correct. They responded with, very defensively. And from that point, the coverage, I think, people became more skeptical of coverage. So the credibility of the press has been in decline. I'm not saying it's because of my essays, but that has happened. But the press itself has become more wedded to an activist interpretation of the profession, because fundamentally, and I think you've seen this too, that's what changed. It became acceptable not to practice explanatory journalism, but to use journalism as a form of activism. My colleagues, many of them, not all of them, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, they didn't want to explain a complicated story that was boring or not fulfilling enough. They wanted to use journalism as a sword to be placed in the hands of the oppressed, essentially. And stories that served that purpose would be inflated to the extent possible, and stories that worked against that purpose, even if they were true, would be played down or erased entirely. And I gave examples in those essays, but it's not just true of the Israel story. Of course, it's true of stories across the board. Much journalism now is quite obviously simply a form of ideological fantasy that's meant to encourage the reader to reach a certain political conclusion.
Yeah. We have some examples. This is the Time magazine, you can see it here, Time magazine cover story on the famine in Gaza with this photograph on the cover. But the photographer who took this picture, is this guy. And here we see a stage situation. Look. Oh. This. And this is the photographer. So why is Time magazine accepting this photo?
I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that there is a real human tragedy in Gaza. So when I criticize the press, the way it operates in Gaza and has since my time in the press, I'm not saying that there isn't suffering in Gaza, and I'm not saying that this war was not a tragedy. I'm also not making a case for the brilliance and morality of the Israeli government. I think we have the worst government we've ever had, and that's also important for me to say. However, the story of the war in Gaza has been dictated to a very large extent by the campaign against Israel, which is run very effectively, not just by Hamas, but by affiliated NGOs and journalists who are on board ideologically, who have really manufactured a version of reality that comes at the reader or the viewer from many different directions at the same time. So you're getting it from Time magazine, the New York Times, you're seeing it on Dutch TV, you're seeing it on the BBC, you're getting it from the UN, you're getting it from Amnesty International, you're getting it from Human Rights Watch. How could it not be true? Of course it's true, but it's an echo chamber of ideologically affiliated people who are acting in concert. And how does it work? Stories are manufactured and storylines are manufactured. The famine story was a big story in the summer of 25.
25, yeah.
Oh God, Time has been working in a very strange way, but that really was a gripping story. The New York Times put on the front page, and I think it's true of Dutch newspapers as well, a picture of a child who suffered from a genetic disability, a terrible picture, really heart-rending, and said in the caption, this child is a victim of an Israeli starvation campaign, and that was false. And in fact, there's an internal communication at the New York Times about this photograph where the editor is saying, don't we have a picture of someone who's actually the victim of a famine? And if you can't find one, that should be raising questions. Why can't we find pictures of famine? Why do we need to manufacture them? Maybe because it's not happening in the way that we're describing. But because the press now fulfills an activist function, the question is not, is this true? The question is, who does this help? That's the question that these journalists are asking. When I come to a story, my question is, what's going on? Basically, that's the journalistic question. An activist journalist asks, who does this help? Will this story help the right people or will it help the wrong people? So this story is, there is hunger in Gaza at this time. There's not a widespread famine and it's not being engineered by Israel, but there is hunger. But if we can orchestrate the image of a mass famine in Gaza and project it through every information pipeline to the West, will that help the right people? Yes. In the mind of the journalist, yes, that will help the right people, and it will hurt the right people, which is the Israelis. So it doesn't matter if it's true or not. And in a very interesting way, it's much more similar to a religious way of thinking. So if you grew up with religion and you went to synagogue on Shabbat and the rabbi talked about Moses splitting the Red Sea, okay, did that happen? Is that true? That question misses the point in religion. Like, did that happen is not a question that we're really asking. The question is, does this story make you do good in the world? Was Jesus resurrected on the third day? Did that happen? Okay, but the question for religion is, does this make you a better person? Is this true in the sense of an ideological or religious truth, not in the sense of did it happen? And asking did this happen is actually missing the point. And because many of the reporters now operate in I would say, a semi-religious or pseudo-religious mindset where they're ideologically identified with a version of reality that is very much broken into oppressors and oppressed, they would say that this is true, or that photograph, that terrible photograph of the child is true. Yes, it could be true, or in a deeper sense, it is true even if it didn't happen, if that makes sense. And there's one great example, which we were discussing earlier, maybe the monument to this era in the press is actually a Canadian story, which is not related to Israel, but I think it makes the point. There was a story a few years ago in Canada about 215 unmarked graves of indigenous children discovered at a residential school in British Columbia. The residential schools are a dark chapter in Canada's history. Indigenous kids were taken from their families and re-educated to become Western, often by the Catholic Church. Anyway, Canada's very ashamed of this, as it should be. There's a story about the discovery of 215 unmarked graves, and it explodes across the world. Front page of the New York Times. It was definitely reported in Holland. The Prime Minister of Canada shows up and bends his knee, and they bring the flags down to half-mast, and they start talking about genocide. The number of graves discovered at the school is 0. The story is a complete fabrication.
Zero.
Zero graves were found at the school. It's a complete fabrication. That's obvious quite early, but it's one of those stories it didn't happen, but it's true. It's true because it makes the point that the left is trying to make, which is that our societies are built on the graves of innocent children. So it's an irresistible story. It's an irresistible story, just like this one, even if the facts don't add up. And unfortunately, much of our profession now operates in that mindset and not in the older explanatory mindset.
Okay, let's talk about the sources in the war. We have some other examples, like this one. So this is the Dutch newspaper, a left-wing newspaper, the Volkskrant, and it says, this was actually, of course, a rescue operation in 2024. IDF rescued a couple of hostages. One of them was the 26-year-old Noah Argamani. And this is the headline of the progressive Dutch newspaper, quoting one source, Hamas, rescue operation Israel extremely cruel. So the same, this is another from the same newspaper. Hamas, already 21 dead since the resume of the Israeli war. So Israel is not allowing reporters into Gaza. So the newspapers have only one source. I mean, it's Hamas, or it's the Ministry of the Ministry of Health. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, by not allowing reporters into Gaza during the war and now, is the Israeli government helping Hamas? I mean, Hamas has won the information war. Do you agree?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. Israel had a case. It would have been very hard, even for a very talented Israeli government, to win the information war, given what the press is and how things are set up. But it should be said, we've had an atrocious, basically non-existent public diplomacy campaign. Our foreign ministers throughout this war have been essentially non-entities. And this is a bad time to have a dysfunctional government. I mean, we should have had our best and smartest people out in front, explaining to people in the West why we're doing what we're doing. We might not have had a choice, but we need to explain it, and we didn't explain it. And even for people like me who basically think that even a left-wing government in Israel would have fought more or less this war. So I don't think we should be deluded about that. But even someone like me who tries to make a case for the essential logic of Israeli thinking and the fundamental goodness of Israeli society, we're not out to be cruel, and we're not, trying to do evil. And then I look back at Israel and I have Ben Gvir. So what am I supposed to say as a defender of Israel? So I think we've made our case much more difficult for ourselves. However, the question of reporters is a more complicated one, and there's a contradiction, I think, even in the question, which I get a lot from Western news organizations. Why isn't Israel allowing reporters into Gaza? Well, all of the Western press organizations have claimed since October 7th that they're covering in Gaza. I mean, in fact, there's been blanket coverage from Gaza since October 7th. Who is doing the coverage? Clearly, there are journalists in Gaza. Now, is there a problem with the journalists in Gaza? Right? If there is, I haven't heard what it is. That is Sky News, for example. I was asked in an interview on Sky, why aren't you letting reporters in? Okay, Sky has reporters in Gaza. Sky is showing, in a loop footage from Gaza. Is there a problem with your people in Gaza? Are they, for example, intimidated by or members of Hamas? Is that what you're saying? Is that why you need to get Western reporters in to replace the Palestinians? I mean, if so, I would like to hear that, because you haven't made clear to your viewers that you're passing on compromised information. They pretend to be covering. Sky News pretends to have reporters in Gaza. And if they don't, they should say. And then maybe we can talk about getting other reporters in, but we have to start from that point. The desire or the idea that if we could only get Western reporters into Gaza, there would be free coverage in Gaza is based on a misunderstanding of how things work in Gaza. Once you're in Gaza, there are two options. Either you're embedded with the IDF, as I was, by the way, 1 week ago, which is just mind-blowing to think. A week ago, right from this very hour, I was in a tunnel under Gaza in Sajaiya, which is a suburb of Gaza City, with the IDF. That's one option. The other option is essentially that you're embedded with Hamas. There's no Dutch reporters walking around interviewing people and freely reporting information. How does it work? Even if you're allowed to walk around the Palestinian-controlled areas of Gaza, which are Hamas-controlled, even if you're allowed to go around and you don't have a Hamas minder pointing a gun at your head, you're working with local staffers. This is the key that people don't get if you're on the outside. You go into Gaza, you're not alone. You have a driver, you have a fixer, you have a photographer, and you might have a translator. So you have 2 or 3 people who are with you. These are Palestinians who live under Hamas control. They will not cross Hamas, even if they're honest, moral people who hate Hamas. They will not cross Hamas. Of course, I wouldn't either if I were them. And that means that your coverage is hostage to Hamas. Because if you come out of Gaza and report something terrible about Hamas, you're endangering your local staffers. And at the AP, we were constantly told we can't report because we're endangering our people in Gaza. So once you have people in Gaza who live with the Hamas gun to their head, you yourself have made your coverage hostage essentially to Hamas. So the idea that if we could only open the gates and let Western reporters wander around, we'd have a sense of what's going on, that's very naive. It's a misunderstanding of what's happening. I'm not saying necessarily that we shouldn't, but I'm saying that it's not as easy. The dilemma is not as easy as it's being presented.
Yeah. And news media should know better.
For some reason, Western news organizations have never seen the need to explain to viewers and readers the compromises they're making with repressive regimes. Now, I'm not sure how it is in your experience, but if there are reporters in Iran right now covering the funeral of the Ayatollah. There are restrictions on the press in Iran, right? You can't report whatever you want. What are the restrictions? Good question. I haven't been told. If you're reporting in North Korea, if you're reporting in most places in the world, in fact, if you're, you've cut some deal in order to be able to report. What's the deal? Yeah. So it's clear that the reporters in Gaza, not from October 7th, from my time at the AP, have a deal with Hamas. You are allowed to report X as long as you don't report Y. Yeah. And in the industry, everyone knows the deal, but the readers don't know the deal.
Let's look at one of the most trusted, this one. This is the BBC. This is the BBC. This is an icon of independent journalism through the years. The BBC had broken their own journalistic guidelines 1,500 times during the Gaza war. So this is a news item which should lead to the question, what happened to journalism?
Indeed, and I don't think it's just true of the BBC. I mean, once you make the decision that you're going to cover in Gaza and be credulous about the information coming out of Gaza, and once you decide that you can lie in pursuit of justice, of course, your guidelines are out the window. Essentially, modern journalists are being judged by archaic standards. So the BBC guidelines are probably from medieval times, right, the 1990s. Yeah. But the journalists who are now doing the coverage think that their job is to libel Israel so far into disrepute that its dilemmas become impossible to understand so that the country can be rendered anathema. That's really what they're trying to do, and by the way, they've done it with a great measure of success. Many people in the industry would say that that's their job, because the Palestinians need the help of the good of the world, and journalists are actually part of a coalition. Journalists are not external observers who are here to explain what's going on. We are part of an alliance of people fighting for justice, and that alliance includes the United Nations, and it includes Amnesty International, and it includes a plethora of different NGOs which share the social world of the press in Israel. So if you're a reporter in Israel and you've been sent from the Netherlands, or you've been sent from Canada or Britain or whatever, your social world is the world of NGOs and expats and UN officials. That's who you date. That's who you hang out with. When you leave journalism, that's who's going to hire you. So journalists came to see themselves as part of this alliance, which is not the same thing as being a journalist.
Yeah.
In fact, it contradicts being a journalist. What's proof? I'll just say one last thing. What's proof that this is true? In journalism, the question is always, who do you cover and who do you quote? So what's a target for coverage and what is a source to be quoted? The organizations that are mentioned are always quoted and never covered. That's why you'll never see an expose of Amnesty International or an expose of the UN arms in Israel. It's strange, right? These are massive, powerful organizations that have a lot of discontented personnel in Israel. I know because I used to meet them. You'll never see that covered because the press perceives itself essentially as the megaphone or the press arm of the NGO world.
But is this a change of journalism which happened in a few years? But I mean, what happened? I mean, you have to throw all your journalistic ethics into the garbage. I mean, this is astonishing.
But as someone who's been in this business for longer than I have, what do you think happened?
I think it's activism. I think there's a new generation of journalists who are younger, who are more activists, more politics, and don't care about two sides of the story instead of one side of the story. I think that's a very important thing. What do you think?
Right, I think that even the idea that there are two sides of the story is perceived as playing into the hands of evil. Because if you explain why Israel, for example, why does Israel believe that it has to hold on to the West Bank? Why do most Israelis, including Israelis of the left and center left like me, why do we believe that we can't withdraw from the West Bank? There's a good reason for that, right? We're worried that if a vacuum is created in the West Bank, it will be filled by the same forces that filled the vacuum in Gaza when we pulled out, and South Lebanon when we pulled out, and the cities of the West Bank when we pulled out in the 1990s. So it makes sense if you're Israeli, but if you explain that, you're playing into the hands of fascists, and you're working against the people who are the good guys in your story. So the idea that there are two sides is, they would say this is corrupt. You have to tell the truth, and that involves making it very clear to the reader where the line between good and evil is. And that's why we have this kind of journalism, not just on Israel, that is incredibly binary, and it's true of environmental coverage. It's true, fossil fuels. It's true in America of political coverage. I mean, the President of the United States in his last term, let's leave aside the current president, but the last President of the United States was clearly senile for much of his term.
Yeah.
Now, this is a massive global story.
Yeah, look, this is the one.
Oh, there you go. I didn't even know that was...
Yeah. I mean, this is Jake Tapper. He's a famous TV guy from CNN, and he admits that there was not enough media coverage of Biden's mental decline.
One of the questions here is, why do TV guys have these glasses? What's going on?
No, but this is the idea was we don't want Trump for a second term.
Correct. It's a political calculation. So the press is making a political calculation that even though, there are dozens of reporters covering the White House every single day. I was in the AP bureau once when I was working for the AP. I accompanied Olmert was the prime minister. I accompanied him on a state visit to the White House, and I was in the AP press room at the White House. There were about a dozen AP reporters covering the White House. That's just one news organization. So you've got a huge press corps. You see that briefing room where they give briefings and it's full of people. Those are the reporters covering the White House. The president can't, at times, seem to string a sentence together, and yet this is not being covered.
Yeah.
Why? Even though this is maybe the biggest political story in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not being covered because it will help Trump, and Trump is the wrong person. So if the question you're asking is, who does this help? Then clearly the answer is we don't report this story even though it's true. Yeah. And it's applied, you can apply it to many, many different stories, and it's one reason that we're all living with this feeling that we're in a blizzard of disinformation, that we're being bombarded with lies on social media, and we go to the islands of sanity, CNN or the AP or the New York Times, and we get more disinformation.
Maybe there's another motive for journalists and news outlets to report these kinds of stories, but the rage click, the click economy, because it's economy. It's for the Volkskrant and for Wall Street Journal, for all kinds of media outlets. It's very important to earn the money, and they earn money with rage clicks. Agree?
Yes, that happens kind of at the same time. So when I'm at the AP, suddenly Facebook and Twitter changed the economics of the press. And it used to be that you would have a big newspaper, and the way you'd make money was by selling ads. You know, you're the New York Times, you sell ads to a big, you know, Bloomingdale's or some big American department store, and they will pay you a lot of money because they think that your paper is going to get in front of a lot of people. So you have an interest in pitching very broadly, so that your paper has a line. You know, the New York Times is always a liberal paper, but they want it to be as broad as possible, so that as many people as possible will see the Bloomingdale's ad, so they can charge Bloomingdale's a lot of money for the ad. Social media changes the calculation, because now the ad money is not going to the New York Times, it's going to Facebook. So you need to change your model, and the model becomes essentially subscriptions and clicks. Subscriptions means that you're now prisoner to your subscribers. So your subscribers want a certain kind of story, they like certain stories, and you have an interest in giving them those stories. And it's been proven that the most predictable or the most dependable predictor of clicks is rage. That is most likely to make you click on a story. So if I write a story that says, "Another complicated day in the Middle East Tuesday." Anyone jumping into that story? Sounds fascinating, let's all go read it. But if I write a story that says, you know, Israeli army starves 5,000 Palestinians, then you're even if you are sympathetic to Israel, you're angered or you're angered against. And so that's the way the ecosystem is essentially driven by kind of outrage, which keeps on moving into more extreme territory, because you have to keep delivering, you have to up the dosage. It's like drugs. You need to constantly change the story and up the dosage. And that's why in Gaza, really, you could write a doctorate about it, but it starts with Israel killing civilians on purpose. That happened with that story about the hospital being hit 3 weeks into the war, which wasn't a true story. But the idea is that Israel's killing civilians on purpose. That lasts for a couple months until it loses its edge. Then it becomes Israel killing children. That was also a very potent story, of course, for many reasons. Then it becomes Israel killing medical personnel. That was a story for a while, and everyone's doing it. All the different media outlets are doing it, and different NGOs are putting out reports on medical personnel and hospitals, and this was a story. And then it becomes journalists. And actually one of the most memorable stories to be generated by the anti-Israel campaign is Israel's killing journalists. Why does that work so well? Because journalists have to cover it. If you put out a report saying Israel's killing journalists, every single journalist has to cover that story. Now, if you've been following in the past couple of weeks, something interesting has happened, which is that Hamas and Islamic Jihad have begun putting out their martyr notices, which they do always belatedly after every war. And lo and behold, many of the journalists are squad commanders in the Jihad, they're rocket commanders in Hamas, then Al Jazeera guy is a Hamas sniper. I mean, you understand, if you know how this works, that this was always the case, but no one remembers. The campaign has already succeeded, and the campaign has moved on to the next story: starvation, drought. There's always something that keeps people interested and keeps people clicking, which is why we're in such Baroque territory, which is basically medieval, about evil Jews killing people because they like it, and genocide, and then scholasticide, and different terms are invented to keep the outrage cycle going. It's terrible for Israel. It's terrible for the sanity of the world, but it clearly is serving the interests of certain news organizations.
So this is a very bad situation, mental situation for journalism these days. So what is the effect of the state of journalism for the public opinion? What does it do?
I think that instead of becoming an island of sanity, which was really the only viable option, I think, for the legacy press in the age of social media, you have a situation where people are just being bombarded with nonsense. Political propaganda, commercial propaganda, you're online. Initially, we were so innocent about it. We thought social media was going to bring people together, and there would be citizen journalists, and who needs real journalists, because we're just going to get the truth from. And it turns out that we're all subject to influence campaigns from Russia and Qatar and whatever, Coca-Cola or whoever's trying to sell us something. The legacy media could have said, "We are your island. Swim to us, and we have experts, and we have people who speak the languages, and we have people who are going to deliver cool, impassionate analysis that is going to be a refuge for you in this age of disinformation. That's going to help you make decisions about who to vote for, and that's very important." And that could have saved at least some of the legacy media outlets. But as I saw, and I think as you saw too, the reporters didn't want to be the island. They didn't want to cover the circus. They wanted to be in the circus. They wanted to be dancing bears in the circus. They also wanted to be activists. So now when I escape, the craziness on Twitter and I look at the New York Times, I find basically more craziness, just written in better English. Essentially, that's what it is, or Dutch in the case of your media. But I'm not getting something that's fundamentally different. I'm still getting a kind of propaganda written by activists, intended to both get me to click on the story and then drive me into an ever more extreme ideological position.
Another aspect, it is almost in the same direction. In April, you wrote for the Free Press an essay on the phenomenon you called gazology. Can you explain what you mean by that?
This is my attempt to get a word into the English language. When I say that gazology, I just want to make clear that I'm not talking about reportage of Gaza. So the war in Gaza, again, has been a vast human tragedy, and it deserves to be reported. So I'm not critiquing the fact that it's being reported, and again, I'm not defending every action of the Israeli government. I'm not belittling the suffering of the people in Gaza, even though I think that it's their leadership that bears the brunt of the responsibility for it. So just to make clear what I'm talking about, gazology is a word that's popped into my head when I was in a bookstore in Washington, D.C., early this year. And I was in DC, it could have been in Amsterdam, it could have been in London, it could have been in LA or New York, it could have been more or less anywhere in the West. You've definitely seen this. You walk into an independent bookstore and there is a massive shelf of books about Gaza, Palestine, Zionism. Sometimes they're displayed front and center in the store. In this bookshop, it was a full shelf, which I'd never seen before. I always check out the Mideast section. I'd never seen that number of books, and many of them were new. And I kind of with a sinking heart, I realized I was gonna have to read them. And I know I was gonna sacrifice probably 5 years of my life, not in time spent, but in like angst that would build up as cholesterol in my heart or something like that. But I sat down and I chose 5 of these books, and I decided I would do a comparative survey to see if I could talk about this as a genre, because it's clearly a new Western literary genre, and it's not an analysis of Gaza. That's the most important thing to say. Most of the writers have never been to Gaza or Israel. What it is an attempt to use Gaza as a way of understanding evil in the world. And there are attempts to draw a line between Gaza, or the imaginary Gaza, and every other problem that preoccupies the left. So there's a book about Gaza and the climate. It's called
Climate.
Yes, it's called "The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth." And it's written, I mean, it sounds funny. I had to read it, believe me. It wasn't funny, although actually at times it was unintentionally comic. It's written by a very hardcore Swedish Marxist who, his day job is as a professor at some, university in Sweden, but he writes that he imagines himself to be a PFLP fighter. So he has a very active fantasy life. But his, he draws a line between Zionism and fossil fuels.
Oh?
We could, I mean, it's not obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, you must be fascists if you don't get it.
The problem is, it sells. The books are selling.
I mean, this is a good question. I don't know. They're certainly being displayed, they're certainly being written, they're certainly being published.
Yeah, they're getting prizes.
They're getting prizes. One of the books that I reviewed is called "One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This," which is actually a really good title. And it's written by an Egyptian-born Canadian journalist who now lives in the United States. And I read it, you might have seen it, I'm sure it was translated into Dutch. It won the National Book Award, which is a huge American literary prize. It has a very striking cover. It's a red cover with a stylized little girl and a bomb about to fall on her head. And if you go into bookstores in Amsterdam, I'm sure you'll find it. And I expected when I opened it to find a description of the war in Gaza. That's what I was bracing myself to read, and I didn't expect to like it, but I said, okay, this guy's trying to figure out the war, and he's seeing it not from the Israeli side. But it's not about the war in Gaza. In fact, he's almost remarkably uninterested in the actual war in Gaza. It's about him. And it's about the experience of immigration and his sense of alienation. And Gaza is in the background as an illustration of his internal psychological state. But the main feature of the genre is that it's incredibly narcissistic. So there's a.
It's about him.
It's about them. It's about the authors.
Yeah.
It's not about Palestinians. I can take a version of events that is written from the Palestinian perspective and gets across that tragedy and doesn't take my view into account. Okay, yeah, that's life. But these books are for these people, and I write this in the essay. Gaza is not a subject for them. It's a stage.
Yeah.
They make no attempt to understand Gaza. They take Gaza, what they think they know about Gaza, genocide, evil
Injustice.
Jews who have become Nazis, essentially, and they use it to make a different point. One of them wants to make a point about literature. One of them, there's a book that draws a line between Gaza and LGBT issues. There's a book called Gaza and Feminism. It sounds, you can chuckle, but university students, within a few years, if it's not already happening already, in a wide variety of disciplines, anthropology, political science, literature, maybe medicine, engineering, they're going to be invited to view evil in the world through the lens of Gaza, meaning that the barrier between them and the just world that we seek is Jews. That's the essential message here. We dream of a world of justice, and what's standing in between us and justice is this entity called Israel, these people called Zionists. It's actually, we can laugh about it, and some of the writing is so bad that it's laughable, but actually it's deadly serious, and what it is an extremely effective form of poison.
Yeah. And it's trendy. It's
very
to be anti-Israel and to be pro-Palestinian. I have another picture of that. Look at this one. This is Javier. His name is Javier Bardem. He's a Spanish actor, and he's a millionaire, I think, and he's a member of the Hollywood Palestinian resistance group.
He's a comrade of my Swedish friend, I think. They fight in the same battalion of the PFLP.
Yeah. But this is an icon of how popular Palestinian is, and to be like a Palestinian.
There's a very interesting writer who I really recommend. Like many great writers today, he's homeless and he writes on Substack, and his name is Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour. Yeah, you know him. I really recommend him. He's a really unique thinker. He's a kid. He grew up in Egypt, in a poor neighborhood in Egypt, found his way to America, and is kind of a genius. And he writes very offbeat, really interesting things about the Middle East, about Islam, about Egyptian literature, about Israel, about Zionism. And he has an interesting essay, more than one, but he has an essay where he talks about Palestine as a word symbol. And because obviously this is not the world of analysis of a very complicated geopolitical problem that really has no solution. This is we're in the world of symbols, and what this symbolizes is, it would be interesting to take a poll in the room and ask, what do you think what is going on in this picture? What does this symbolize? Anyone?
He's good.
He's good, yeah. Anyone else?
I don't know English.
Say it in Dutch.
Morally okay.
Right, morally okay. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Like this is. Yes, I agree with all of that. Essentially, he's saying this encapsulates a long list of causes. Palestine has become what is called the omni-cause. So if you are wearing this, if you're wearing the keffiyeh, which is, by the way, a piece of clothing with a complicated history, but it has become a symbol of basically every anti-Western cause. And it symbolizes a coalition, which is really striking when we think about it. You can mobilize a really diverse coalition behind this symbol. You might not like the Chinese Communist Party, but you will not have any luck getting people out to protest the Chinese Communist Party. And we all have Chinese-made iPhones. And you might not like the Russians. No one likes the Russians, okay, but no one's protesting the Russians. If you can mobilize against Zionists or Israel, you will get conservative Muslims, queers for Palestine, the university kids, anarchists, labor unionists, and a wide variety of people who agree on very little. So this is a very effective symbol, and I don't think this actor knows anything about about Gaza or the intricacies of Palestinian society or the currents in the Islamic world which are driving violence across the Islamic world. He probably couldn't tell you that there are 7 million Jews in the Middle East and 300 million Arab Muslims. This is a symbol of being on the right side, which is the side against the West, on the side of the oppressed against everything that we define as as Western. So there is actually, we can also scoff at this picture, but there's a lot going on here, and there's, I think, a real reason for concern.
I mean, it's also maybe, I think, it's a way of guilt by his own standards and wealth. And
Yes, that's a very interesting point. I mean, this is a way of being on the right side of things without any cost.
Yeah.
So, you know, what Americans who've been thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and why does the Black Lives Matter movement kind of peter out and to be replaced by this? Because Black Lives Matter actually demands something of you as an American. That is an American issue, and you can act to rectify it. Or if you really take seriously the plight of, you know, indigenous people in America, that might demand something of you. You might, you know, have to give your house back to someone who owned the land before. That, you know, that's quite
there is a case
disturbing.
There's a case of a Hollywood actor who is living, having a house on stolen land, and okay,
It's a hip hop.
yeah.
Absolutely, but the Palestine symbol, again, separating it from what is actually happening, which is not, you know, there's a lot that's really going on. It allows you to be on the side of the right without actually sacrificing anything because it's 8,000 miles away. So it's a low-cost, high-value mode of identification that seems to be quite quite popular among elites.
Back to journalism. Final question. This is a lady before the New York Times, and she's convinced that honest journalism is dead. Do you agree?
First of all, I've never understood, I have to say. Of course, I sympathize with this lady. I'm sure her heart is in the right place. But there are all these protests outside the New York Times building. And I mean, I don't know if you know Jews from New York, but my dad is one. They have a very weird emotional relationship with the New York Times. Because I always tell my dad, if the New York Times isn't good, just stop reading it. Like if your toothpaste has lead in it, don't use that toothpaste, use another kind of toothpaste. But they can't, they go protest it. Why are you protesting outside the building of the New York Times? It's a product, just stop consuming it. But yes, understanding what she's trying to say.
But maybe for years they're reading the New York Times and they see a change. The change we were discussing.
For American Jews, the New York Times is, for liberal Jews in America, the New York Times is part of their identity. It is their identity card. And American Jews worked so hard to be accepted by the institutions of liberal America, the New York Times, Columbia University, Harvard University, the Democratic Party, and to be turned upon by those institutions has been gutting, really gutting for people. And I see that pain. She seems kind of happy in this picture, but she's feeling internal pain, I'm sure. But anyway, there's a lot going on in this picture. Is honest journalism dead? No. I think that there are still excellent journalists, and there are still outlets which are doing a good job. So I think that
Which one?
We can talk. The Telegraph is excellent.
Yeah.
So I hear. I can't read Dutch, but so you've told me. So I would have to leave it. No. There are excellent journalists inside the old institutions. So even at the New York Times, which I think I have a very low opinion of it, there are excellent journalists in the system who are doing their best. The Atlantic is a really excellent American magazine that I write for on occasion, and I think they've done an admirable job of keeping their balance in the storm of events. And so I would not say that honest journalism is dead. The free press is an attempt to kind of create something, kind of a counter wave, and there are a lot of people, like my friend Hussein, who are kind of homeless on Substack trying to do something. So I think we're in an interim period where the old institutions have essentially gone bankrupt, and with a few exceptions, and we don't know what's coming next, where everything's in flux, and everything's in flux in the media world, but everything's in flux in the world in general. I mean, clearly the post-World War II order that we all grew up with is disintegrating. The United Nations, the European state system, America, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the institutions are disintegrating, and we don't know, or the plates are shifting, and we don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years. So I think the media story is kind of part of that story, and I think this will be clear to us in 20 years, but it's the kind of thing that we can't understand while it's going on.
Okay. Matti Friedman, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert. And thank you so much.